Hello, my name is Dari, and this is a review of Werewolf Magick by Denny Sargent. Reading the prelude and the introduction almost make me feel bad about the rest of this review. Granted, before we even get to those things, we get this, which is part of a warning we get in the beginning of the book. And you know a book is going to be good when there is a warning about its contents like this. Very quickly stating that neither the publisher or the author have legal liability, which again is not how legal liability works. The author also goes through thanking a bunch of people, including the OTO and the Golden Dawn, which this book was published in 2020. And these groups technically don't exist anymore. There are definitely organizations that claim descent from them, but Now, specifically, the part that makes me almost feel bad is that this book does seem to at least have a want to be genuine, and it appears that this came out of experiences that involve a decent amount of trauma, as you can read below. Everything seems to imply a want to be genuine, and it definitely coming from actual personal experiences. At least that's the way it wants to present itself. However, somewhere between the author, the editor, and publication, if I am to assume this is true, a lot of weird things happen along the way. And there definitely does seem an attempt to try to stay grounded, such as saying that he's using shapeshifting as like a metaphor, more or less astral shapeshifting in the term that a lot of people use. But again, the way he goes about it, which I'll go into later in the review, is very questionable. He also tries to be grounded enough to try to add humor to the book, including mentioning furry circles, which bold move, Cotton, to mention furries in your werewolf book. There are certain things that happen throughout the book that I feel I should place here as to not disrupt the flow of the rest of the review. Now, this is a minor one. The author refers to the Earth in general as Gaia, not necessarily referring to the goddess, just the Earth itself. And this may be unintentional, but as someone who also plays role-playing games, associating werewolves with Gaia gives me very much Werewolf the Apocalypse vibes from the World of Darkness series, and it's very difficult to not put certain influences when those two things are together. Very likely unintentional, but it's there. In general, also relevant to the review, is that this book is a little too eclectic for my taste. Again, this doesn't mean that makes the book inherently bad. It's just they randomly talk about Greek and Roman figures. They bring in some Norse ideas. We randomly have a visit from even a comedic deity. It's a lot. I get what they're going for, but that's, again, going to be later. And throughout the book, there's also things that should have been double-checked by an editor, by someone, such as this little bit here of saying what the ancient Norse called a werewolf. That is not the Norse way of saying that. Specifically, that pronunciation and that spelling is either Old English or Old Saxon, which, while related, is not that word in Norse and Norse-related languages. There's also something he keeps mentioning throughout the book, which is that we, as humans, share 84% of our genetics with canines that include wolves, and this is something he just keeps bringing up. Our DNA also has relations to bananas, but I never see anyone talk about the great were-banana. And on a more serious and direct relation note, we share a lot more genetics with things like chimps and bonobos, but again, not an aspect that I see. Throughout the book, he also just keeps saying that it's a focus of magical, spiritual, and psychological, even though I even tried to do research, there is no inclination that the author has any formal training in psychology, or any indication that he was professionally advised, and seems to use terms and ideas that are often misrepresented by the spiritual community already. That being said, I will still give credit where credit is due. He Weil kind of toes the line a little bit of trying to say that this book is about some ancient secrets that are associated with shamanism, he does state there is a separation on how it came about. Like, he himself does not hold that he is a shaman. He seems to respect shamanism to a large degree. Like, I can at least get behind that he's trying to be respectful about the cultures that he's effectively stealing from. So the first actual chapter that we're getting into is about the history of werewolfdom, werewolfery, and all of that. If you're already familiar with researching the subject of werewolves, you are most likely not going to find anything new, but particularly this book is really weird about basically trying to say that there is damn near an unbroken line of this werewolf magic. And I'm only going to give one example because pretty much the whole chapter is like this. So a lot of the chapter talks about either references to wolves in mythology or specifically gods that are wolves, making incredibly broad and exaggerated claims as if they're fact, while putting it in with actually academically attested to myth or knowledge. Such as saying that there was a specific werewolf cult that predate the worship of the Hellenic gods in Greece, lumping in any sort of wolf animal cult to automatically be werewolf cults, and trying to make things again somewhat exaggeratory to say that there is a continual line that goes through. Such as in this case, we get the ancient Greek, where Zeus takes over the werewolf cult and gets his own werewolf aspect, and that continues, and then he talks about other gods. He goes into Rome and then says how that relates to Celtic, Norse, and a few other mythologies. Combining, the meanings behind the myths with actual history to try to create this unbroken line that supposedly lasted until the industrial era. And again, credit where credit is due. He also tries to bring in like the magical aspect of this being important, because he does bring up the fact that people who were tried as witches were often also tried for being werewolves. Which, while good information to present when you're talking about the history of werewolves, again is disingenuous, because we're talking about mainly people who were falsely accused of these things, and we're trying to put the deaths of these people to consolidate a claim of some great magical lineage. The detail, I believe, is to be commended, but the information in of itself, I think, is better found elsewhere. Chapter 2 is primarily informational, as if talking to apprentices, so there's not a lot to say about this chapter, but there's enough to talk about. It goes over the expectation of contents, including some adult ones that are in the book, as well as it actually has like a key for magic terms, which I do think should be used more often in books, in like near the beginning. And he also acknowledges that the animal self doesn't need to necessarily be a wolf, so he does seem to at least acknowledge that other animal self-interested people might be reading this. So yeah, there's props to be had. He also covers legal bases again and talking about entheogens. And I also like that he defines the differences from evoke and invoke. Evoke being to call up powers from within, and invoking, which is calling down such powers. But this chapter also shows a bunch of problems, such as his constant use of the word Seidr to just mean Norse-style magic, which, especially as a Norse pagan and practitioner, not true. And as well as saying that specifically the things with werewolfery have specifically to do with Seidr, which, again, I guess can be an argument, but And also because we're defining things, he has a lot of trouble defining the animal self, the primary focus of the book. Going back and forth between explanations of what the animal self is, where it is, and how you can use it, or if it even has its own sentience. making this thing that is the focus of the entire practice impossible to have a framework for because it can't be defined. All of these problems, and we're still only in chapter 2. So as we move on to the other chapters, which this is a list of them, everything from here to here is a little more into mostly just doing spellwork and rituals, which I personally feel like Magick is done a lot of different ways. Different things connect to a lot of different people, so I'm not going to go like a step-by-step review of the various spells and rituals in here. Mostly I'm just going to be commenting on anything that jumps out at me, but trust me, we're going to get into a lot still. So the next chapter is talking about magic tools. Something that I actually really like about the author, which again kind of makes me feel bad about my opinions of the book, is that he tries to stress efficacy in spellwork. One thing that I legitimately like about the author is that there is a want to be ethical. He talks about environmental efficacy in using the least amount of synthetic products possible, if you are using the remains of something to put honor into that because there is a spirit associated with that, and that is something that's commendable. Even when laying out tools and the reason for things, he states that, like, hey, diamonds are associated with werewolves, but there is an efficacy problem with diamonds, be mindful. Yeah, I like it a lot. Now, he admits that a lot of the things that he recommends is mostly from his personal experience, and so he just kind of lists, like, such as trees. He does the same thing with, like, liquids and food offerings. He does the same with stones. And I would have liked to see more on these, like, why are these associated with werewolves? But that's a personal thing, and again, my Magick is big on specifically the correlation of natural things involved. He also brings up a particular weird feeling I get because he brings up chakras, which isn't mentioned before, and there's not really anything mentioned since about this. Now, granted, I did do some research, and the author has a specific book called Naga Magic, and a few snippets of other books he's written, where he has apparently been to India and has some knowledge about Hinduism, but that doesn't make me feel any less comfortable whenever chakras are mentioned in eclectic kind of environments. Admittedly, it's something that I don't know enough about to be like, oh, this is right, this is wrong, so. But throughout this section of specifically talking about the tools, he does say, hey, this is from my experience. If you feel like something shouldn't be used, don't use it. And if you feel like something should, go ahead and try to use it. And he specifically says, listen to your animal self. So while, again, this causes more confusion about what the animal self is, that is a sentiment that I can get behind. Especially when he's kind of admitting that he's throwing this together from his own random experimentation rather than it being a set path. Despite trying to set itself up as one even later, and that's a thing. He does, however, have a random stroke of genius with what he calls werewolf lingo, which again is genius, but it's cringe. It is the use of basically as close as to the sounds of wolves as we can get, as well as their movements, and this is supposed to enhance the trance-like state, while also putting a lot of those sounds and correlating it to certain elements such as barks to fire and whines to water. Like, yes, it's definitely cringe, but there is a thought process here of sound as a magical implement, which is something that we don't see a lot in a lot of books, unless it's specifically about either, like, drum trance, which is a rare subject. Music magic definitely tries to go into it, but I've had a lot of trouble finding good books on that. But yeah, it's weird that this kinda cringy section of the book is probably one of the best ones. There's really not a lot to talk to about the shapeshifting section. It goes through a lot of... It effectively tries to get you be like, alright, this is how I first shapeshifted. I'm gonna walk you through what it's possibly going to be like. Here's what I did. And yeah, again, it feels wrong to, like, critique someone else's rituals and spells in this kind of public format. There are, however, certain things I noticed, like We just kind of seem to put the word werewolf with any other archetype that is already magically important in a lot of spaces, such as Werewolf of the Crossroads. Now, granted, this isn't a section that's specifically about becoming the werewolf, so this is part of the transformation. So yeah, the crossroads of the human and werewolf self, I guess, but it still comes off as more aesthetic than purposeful about any form of its existence. As well as some bizarre claims, which I can only assume is UPG, but it's also bizarre the fact that Mars is not actually mentioned that much in this book, especially in Ritual. And chapter 6 is called Fetch Work. I have some problems with this, and I'm going to explain why, before we get into what this section is about. I am a Norse Gael pagan, as in I worship and I follow the Norse and the Irish paths. A fetch is something that is heavily associated with a particular Irish being. It's something like a personal guardian. You'll kind of notice that maybe if you're around some Irish paganox, that they'll leave the door open slightly longer for this fetch to also come in with them behind them. It is a separate sentient entity that, while attached to you, is not necessarily a part of yourself, in the same way as this book wants to talk about specifically like doubles, like your astral double, which is what it refers to as fetches, or the Filha, which is a part of the Norse self, which is strangely not mentioned in this book, because I feel like even though that would arguably be a very popular misconception to put into this book, it's still closer than a fetch. That being said, the misconception about the fetch like this is not an uncommon one. It might be a word that's more associated with continental Celtic regions than necessarily the insular island Celtic, but yes, this book specifically uses the word fetch in the part that I believe is a misconception about calling it effectively an astral double, which, to me, confuses what the animal self is even more, because they separate this and the animal self quite a bit in previous chapters. And as we see here, like, after the fetch work, we get more, specifically more in-thorough rituals, werewolf magic with the dead, which feels like trying to put an aesthetic onto something, then there's a practical reason for the aesthetic into it. But we'll stop by at least something that jumped out to me there. And then werewolf magic spells, which seems to be a combination of like actual historical spells that we find, with some, admittedly, some with shaky history, but as well as some theoretical reconstructions of historical spells. The main thing to say about the werewolf ritual section is he brings up raw meat, not in like the must eat raw meat, but he definitely presents it as an option, and even without health problems, eating raw meat can be dangerous and can make you sick. Doing so regularly will definitely do so. But yeah, these last few chapters have a really weird habit that I don't necessarily appreciate, which is they randomly give priestly titles that you state that you are these things. Such as here, saying that you are now a priest of Anpu, which is Anubis. The ritual itself, other than this, looks fine. It's just randomly giving yourself a priestly title like this. This also happens later in the werewolf ritual section, where you call yourself a Luperci, which is Latin for wolf priest, which, while fits, is the name of a specific Roman pagan priest. And of course, along with some other questionable spells in this book, there is a love spell, because why not? Ultimately, I think the book lacks focus, and if this was presented more like a diary than a how-to, I think I would have been way more fine with it. The information in here can be found elsewhere in a much more structured way if you're looking to get into more animalistic and ecstatic practices. Its lack of defining what an animal self is also feels like a cop-out of just trying to say, Yeah, you're right, to any kind of response he gets. Even the parts of this book that I consider mad and cringe genius, I don't think would be worth it to the average practitioner, even if they were new. But I think it's more a misguided project than an intentional scam.